You are Locked On Syracuse, your daily podcast on the Syracuse Orange. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
I want to start off with asking you about some targets for the Orange in the portal. Mike, to your knowledge, what are some position groups that Syracuse at this stage in the offseason are looking at in the portal?
I think the two main ones right now are linebacker and safety. And you can kind of based on who are some of the players that they've offered recently, as well as had visits scheduled. Now, the caveat to that is those scheduled visits didn't end up happening. For example, they had offered Alijah Herring, a linebacker who was transferring from Memphis, who started his career at Tennessee, and he committed to Florida State before his visit to Syracuse started. Two defensive backs, two safeties, who were also scheduled to visit Syracuse, which was supposed to be this week that we're in right now. Sasha Garcia, who was an FCS All-American at William & Mary, he committed to Wake Forest before he got to Syracuse. And Richard Toney, a safety from TCU, committed to Purdue before he came to Syracuse. So unfortunately, from the Syracuse perspective, ththose players that Syracuse had offered and set up visits with had all committed elsewhere before they got to Central New York. But what that does tell us is they're clearly looking for an experienced leader who can come in and sort of fill the void that are left by the departures of Marlowe Wax and Justin Barron. And also they're looking for a safety who maybe can come in and fill the void left by the departed Alijah Clark so that Devin Grant can continue his transition to corner.
Gotcha. And that's very interesting that you mentioned that they want to move Devin Grant to cornerback again.
I think that's the ultimate plan. Now, the good thing about having a player like that is he can do a lot of things. So if you have injury issues, depth issues, if you bring in a safety who, from the portal who maybe doesn't end up being quite as good of a fit as you thought, you've always got Devin Grant that can step in and play there. He did so last year. He kind of bounced back and forth, but keep in mind, they've lost a couple of corners to the transfer portal in Marcellus Barnes and Jaden Bellamy, who started the season as the starters. So when you're losing those two guys, now they brought in a lot of really talented players in last year's recruiting class and a lot of really talented players at the cornerback position in this year's recruiting class, but there's a lot of youngsters there. Devin Grant brings experience. And so I think Syracuse would prefer to have him at least start the season at corner. But again, that's sort of a guess on my part, but I think his versatility certainly helps that group. But just based on the fact that they've targeted safeties makes it clear that that's a position they're focusing on.
That makes a lot of sense because I've been talking about here on this podcast how Syracuse football needs a cornerback in the transfer portal. But if their plan is to move Devin Grant to corner, we'll see if that works or if it doesn't work. Then, well, he's a safety right now. It makes sense why they would target a safety because you're going to need someone to not only fill the void of Alijah Clark, but someone's got to play the position that Devin Grant was playing last season, which was mostly safety. Mike, you alluded to something earlier on in the show about why some players are committing elsewhere before their scheduled visit to Syracuse. So, Mike, why is that the case?
Well, I think you have a few different factors there. So the first is, you can't really ignore the NIL factor in all of this. And I think what's happening is a lot of these schools are overpaying some of the players in terms of what their actual market value would be. And they're basically making offers that those players can't refuse. Now, the Alijah Herring to Florida State, I think Florida State has pretty deep pockets. They can pretty much afford to overpay. But you look at a school like a Purdue, right? They were pretty bad last year, and they've got a brand new coaching staff. They're trying to make a splash. So they probably feel like they might have to overpay for a few guys to really turn over that roster and make it competitive again. So that's kind of part of the deal. Syracuse is also being extremely, I don't know if picky is the right word, but selective maybe is a better phrase. They're being very selective in terms of who they target, who they fund, and who they offer scholarships to, because they don't have very many scholarship slots available. So all of that is I think part of the reason. And the other part of it is Syracuse, even though you mentioned, maybe they would want a corner because of the guys that they have lost. And I mentioned safety, depending on what they do with Devin Grant. they've got a bunch of youngsters that played last year. You look at Ibn McDaniels, who played, and he played in the bowl game and had a couple of good plays. Davian Kerr played quite a bit last year as a true freshman. And you got to figure that a highly ranked guy like Demetrius Samuels and even Caden Singleton, who are coming in, they're going to have an opportunity to play right away. So there's a lot of talent there. And I think the downside to that from a Syracuse perspective is players that are transferring, looking to find a spot where they can play. Maybe they look at a spot like a Purdue or a Wake Forest with new coaching staffs and say, that's a spot where I think I have a better chance to start without as much competition, as opposed to if I go to Syracuse and there's a real chance that even if I go and perform well, that there's going to be someone else that's just as talented or more so that could beat me out.
Gotcha. So, Mike, speaking of players, are there any other players right now out there that Syracuse is eyeing?
Well, it's interesting because most of the guys that they've been eyeing have pretty much committed elsewhere. Now, there is one guy that we're still kind of tracking, and that's an offensive tackle named Rahtrel Perry. He visited Syracuse kind of early on in the transfer portal season, and he's from Central Connecticut. So FCS player, 6'7", extremely athletic. He's visited a lot of schools, Ohio State. Some big name programs have been after him. But since he's visited, his recruitment has been extremely quiet. And so we have heard him in terms of where his recruitment currently stands. And so he's someone we're kind of monitoring right now. But other than that, there really aren't a lot of names that are currently tied to Syracuse. And I think the coaching staff is being intentional with that. They don't want a lot of leaks in terms of who they're targeting and trying to get on visits. That's why we've seen wide receivers like Chris Long and Tyshawn Russell, kind of the signings that kind of came out of nowhere. And even Chris Thomas, the Marshall defensive tackle, even though there was a connection to Syracuse because his younger brother signed with Syracuse in the 2025 recruiting class, there wasn't, chatter as far as he's on campus visiting, he's a strong Syracuse lean. It just kind of was all of a sudden like he's committed. So, and same thing with, Trip Woody, the kicker that they added from Iowa. They've been very intentionally keeping things as close to the vest as possible, which is why I don't think you're hearing a ton of names out there.
Got it, Mike. Also, speaking of offensive linemen, okay, because I just thought of this question off the top of my head because of Rahtrel Perry. The recent JUCO ruling.
Yeah.
How a lot of the players got that extra year of eligibility. We saw John Ray Reed. He exercised that. He went to USC ultimately. Good for him. I'm happy for him. But there's two other offensive linemen that this could impact. Mark Petrie and Jacob Bradford, the two starting guards from this past season. Mike, what have you heard regarding their status with eligibility? Does that ruling impact them in any way?
I believe that it does, because the ruling was supposed to be essentially the way that the kind of background of it is the quarterback at Vanderbilt filed a lawsuit and he got a stay from the court, which essentially means that the, sort of dumbed down version of it, because I had to get a dumbed down version because I don't speak legalese, right? So the dumbed down version was that he is eligible to play in 2025. The court pending and is still going to go through the legal process. But if it is not completed and a decision ultimately made before the 2025 season starts, and he plays for the 2025 season, that Vanderbilt cannot be retroactively punished for playing him, even if he ultimately gets denied his lawsuit and deemed that he would not have had that extra year of eligibility. So what the NCAA said was basically, this isn't fair to everyone else who had a year of who played at the junior college level before coming to, Division I football, that just because he sued, he gets this benefit, but all the other junior college kids do not. And so what they said is anyone who would be out of eligibility 24 season and has at least 1 year of junior college experience in their history will be granted eligibility for the 2025 season.
So
if you had multiple years of eligibility left after 2024, it doesn't give you an extra year of eligibility. But for a guy like Jacob Bradford and Mark Petrie, they were out of eligibility, but because they both played at least 1 year at the junior college level, they, I believe, which is the situation with Jean-Ray Reed, they get an extra year of eligibility in 2025 if they want it.
Okay. Well, that's good insight because honestly, I had no clue. I had
Yeah,
no
and I
idea.
haven't heard anything about whether or not they plan to use that extra year of eligibility and whether or not, if they do, they plan to use it at Syracuse. They haven't made a comment either way. Jean-Ray Reed came out almost immediately after the bowl game and said, I plan on using my extra year of eligibility. And then shortly after that, it was he's in the portal. And then he visited UCLA before he ultimately committed to USC on his visit there. Whereas Bradford and Petrie have been very